But, the day Rhett Calloway chose a wife, half of Blackstone Ridge showed up to watch, and every single one of them was certain they already knew how the story would end. They were wrong. When the most feared man on the frontier passed over the wealthy, the beautiful, and the well-connected and pointed instead to a plain seamstress standing alone at the edge of the crowd, a woman people barely remembered existed, the silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard in that valley. Nobody understood it. Nobody accepted it. And nobody, not even Eliza Thornfield herself, could have predicted what that single moment would set in motion. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you didn't belong, this story is for you. Like this video, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow along because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The morning started the way most mornings did in Blackstone Ridge, with noise. Not the quiet, purposeful noise of people working, but the louder, more irritating kind. The noise of people who had decided in advance that today was going to be interesting and were determined to make it so regardless of what actually happened. Wagons had been rolling into the settlement since before sunrise. Women in their best dresses had spent an hour on their hair. Men who had no particular business being there had invented reasons to linger near the open ground behind the trading post, where Harlan Voss had set up 3 long tables and a 4th one specifically for the whiskey he intended to sell at a notable markup once the proceedings got underway. The occasion, if it could be called that, was Rhett Calloway's choosing. It wasn't a formal event. There was no official name for it, no ceremony anyone had organized on paper. It had grown the way most things in Blackstone Ridge grew, organically, out of rumor and speculation, and the particular frontier habit of turning other people's private business into public entertainment. Someone had heard that Rhett was looking to settle, that he'd been asking around about women willing to come to his mountain property. Someone else had told someone else. By the time the story completed its full circuit of the settlement, it had transformed into something considerably more dramatic. A choosing, a selection, a competition, almost. Though nobody used that word out loud because it made them sound more calculating than they liked to admit they were. But that was what it was. 6 women had made this interest known. 3 of them had family land. One of them, Clara Whitmore, was the daughter of the largest cattle operation within 40 miles and had a reputation for being the most beautiful woman in the valley, a reputation she was entirely aware of and worked to maintain with considerable effort. Another, Dorothea Crane, was a widow of comfortable means who wore her late husband's money like a second skin. The 6th was a woman named Agnes Purdy, who nobody knew much about except that she'd arrived in Blackstone Ridge 6 months ago with a wagon full of household goods and an expression that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing at all times. Eliza Thornfield was not among them. She wasn't anywhere near the gathering, in fact. She was at the far edge of the open ground, standing beside a wooden fence post with a sewing basket balanced on her forearm, because she had agreed to help Mabel Hutchins take in a dress that had grown too large since Mabel's illness. And Mabel's house was a quarter-mile past the trading post, and the route happened to pass directly through the area where every living soul in Blackstone Ridge had apparently decided to congregate this particular morning. Eliza had no intention of stopping. She had heard the rumors about the choosing, the way everyone had heard them, because it was impossible not to hear anything in a settlement of 400 people where the social life ran almost entirely on gossip. She had listened to the women at her customers' doorsteps dissect Rhett Calloway from every conceivable angle. His temper, his land, his stubbornness, his shoulders, the particular quality of his jaw. And she had nodded and hemmed and made the neutral sounds she had perfected over years of being the kind of woman people felt comfortable talking near without necessarily talking to. She had no feelings about Rhett Calloway one way or the other. He was a man she had seen perhaps a dozen times in 3 years of living in the same settlement, and the most they had ever exchanged was a nod when he held a door and she passed through it. She was trying to get past the crowd when she heard Harlan Voss's voice above the noise. All right, quiet down." She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because the crowd between her and the road home had thickened suddenly as people pressed forward, and there was nowhere to go without pushing through. Rhett Calloway was standing on the low wooden platform outside the trading post. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just the angles. The platform was only about 8 inches off the ground, but it was enough to make him visible over the heads of the crowd. and standing still gave him a different quality than the glimpses she'd caught of him moving. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who had done actual physical work for most of his life, not the decorative broadness that some men cultivated. His coat was clean but not new. He hadn't shaved in at least 4 days. His hat was pushed back slightly, and he was looking out at the gathered crowd with an expression that was difficult to read. Not uncomfortable, not pleased, somewhere between the two. Harlan Voss was talking. He was the kind of man who enjoyed talking in front of crowds, who stretched the necessary words into more than were required. And he was doing that now, saying something about community and futures and prosperity. Several people around Eliza had stopped listening. Clara Whitmore had positioned herself at the front of the assembled women with the precision of a woman who had thought carefully about positioning. Dorothea Crane stood slightly to her left, composed and still. Agnes Purdy was behind them both, arms folded. Rhett was not looking at any of them. He was scanning the crowd with a slightly distracted expression, like a man looking for something he'd set down and couldn't immediately locate. Then his eyes stopped moving. Eliza realized with a mild and unpleasant jolt that he was looking at her. She looked behind herself, just to be certain. There was no one there. The fence post, the empty field. When she looked back, he was still looking at her. "Mr. Calloway?" Harlan Voss was saying with the proud finality of a man completing a speech he had written in his head that morning. "The floor is yours." Rhett stepped down off the platform. He walked through this crowd the way he probably walked everywhere, directly, without particular awareness of or interest in the people who had to move to let him through. The crowd parted. The noise level dropped in a strange, rippling way, conversation dying in a wave that spread outward from wherever he was, so that by the time he was halfway to where Eliza was standing, the entire gathering had gone quiet. She didn't move. She genuinely couldn't have explained why. Her feet had simply decided to stay where they were. He stopped in front of her. He was taller up close. He smelled like wood smoke and something sharper underneath it, pine or cold air or both. There was a small scar along his left jaw that she hadn't noticed from a distance. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that was neither one thing nor the other, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that she found difficult to meet and impossible to look away from. "You're the seamstress," he said. "Thornfield." "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "I've been asking around," he said. "People say you're good at what you do, that you're careful, that you don't leave things half-finished." Eliza stared at him. That's very kind of whoever said that." "It wasn't kindness," he said. "It was an answer to a question." She became aware, slowly, and then all at once, that the entire settlement was listening. That 400 people had gone so quiet she could hear the wind moving across the open field and the distant sound of somebody's horse stamping at a hitching post. "My property needs work," Rhett said. "The house is sound, but the systems are a mess. Supplies, tools, food storage, all of it. I've let things go because I've been working alone and there's only so much a man can manage by himself. I need someone who pays attention to those things, who sees what's there and figures out what to do with it." He paused. "I think that's you." Eliza opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm asking you to consider my proposal," he said. "A proper arrangement, legal, respectful." He said the last word with a particular deliberateness that she filed away without fully understanding yet. "You'd have your own space until you decided otherwise. I'm not—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate something. "I'm not a particularly easy man to live with. I'm telling you that up front." "I appreciate the honesty," she managed. "Think on it," he said. "Tell me by sundown." He looked at her for one more moment, then turned and walked back through the crowd. The silence held for another 3 or 4 seconds. Then, all at once, it shattered. "Det." Eliza heard the first laugh before she'd taken 3 steps toward Mabel Hutchins' house. It came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. A woman's laugh, high and deliberate, the kind designed to be heard. Then a second, lower. Then a ripple of voices that she couldn't quite make out individually, but didn't need to, because the tone was perfectly legible without the words. She kept walking. Behind her, she could hear Clara Whitmore's voice, clear and carrying. "Of all the—" He walked right past, and then something lower from whoever was standing next to her, and then another burst of laughter that had a mean edge underneath the amusement. Eliza had heard variations of that sound her entire life. It didn't stop her feet, but it went into her chest and sat there the way it always did, like a small stone she'd have to carry until she had the privacy to put it down. She was 31 years old, and she was under no illusions about how the world saw her. She was plain in the way that meant people forgot she was there. She was heavy-set in the way that, on the frontier, meant women made little cutting comments about fabric requirements, and men looked through her without pausing. She had no family land, no inheritance, no particular social position. What she had was a needle and a good eye, and the ability to sit with a difficult problem until she'd worked out a solution, and a stubbornness about quality that had made her modestly known among the women of Blackstone Ridge as someone worth paying, even if she wasn't worth particularly knowing. She knocked on Mabel Hutchins' door. Mabel was 63 and recovering from a cough that had kept her horizontal for most of the winter, and when she opened the door, she looked at Eliza's face and said immediately, "What happened?" "I need to sit down," Eliza said. She told Mabel about it while she worked, her hands moving through the familiar motions of pinning and measuring while her mind turned the morning over and over like a stone she was checking for cracks. Mabel listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Eliza valued most about her. "Do you want to know what I think?" Mabel said when she'd finished. "You're going to tell me regardless." "I think that man has been watching for longer than this morning," Mabel said. "Men like Rhett Calloway don't make decisions in front of crowds. They make them before they get there. That doesn't tell me whether I should accept." "No," Mabel agreed. "It doesn't, but it tells you the decision was real." Eliza was quiet for a moment, moving a pin. "Everyone is laughing." "Everyone is always laughing at something," Mabel said, "until they're not." Annette. She went to his homestead at 4 o'clock, 2 hours before sundown, because she had decided before she got there and saw no reason to make him wait. She had not changed her dress. She had not done anything particular with her hair. She was aware of both these facts and had decided deliberately that they were the correct choice. If she arrived having made herself presentable in a way she normally wasn't, she would be starting as a performance. She had spent enough of her life performing plainness at people who expected it. She was not interested in performing adequacy for a man who had, apparently, already made up his own mind about her worth. The homestead was a mile and a half outside the main settlement, up a track that was technically passable by wagon, but was clearly better suited to a horse or feet. She went on foot. The property itself, when she came through the final stand of pines and saw it spread out before her, was larger than she'd expected. A main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a fence line that needed work but had been built with good bones. The land was rocky and steep in the way of everything in this valley, but there was a flat stretch near the house where someone had once attempted a kitchen garden and given up midway through. Rhett was outside splitting wood. He set down the axe when he saw her. They looked at each other across about 20 feet of open ground. "You're early," he said. "I've made my decision." He nodded. "And?" "I have questions first." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "All right." "The arrangement you described," she said. "My own space. What does that mean in practical terms? A room with a door that locks? A separate building? Ja, ja. "Room with a door," he said. "Key's yours. I have no copy." "What do you expect of me day to day? Not in general terms, specifically." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. "Food managed and cooked in a way that doesn't leave us short. Supplies tracked. Equipment looked after. Whatever you see that needs doing, done or brought to me if it needs my hands." He paused. "I don't expect constant conversation. I don't need company for its own sake. I need someone who is competent and who won't run when things get difficult." "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, not a speech. The real reason." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. A horse shifted in the barn. "I watched you once," he said, "about a year ago, at the Hendersons' place. Their fence post was failing on the east side, the whole line was going to come down, and there were 6 people standing around arguing about how to fix it. You were there with your sewing basket, delivering something, and you stood there and watched them argue for about 2 minutes. Then you went and got a piece of timber from their stack. Didn't ask, didn't announce it, propped the post, wedged a rock underneath it, and walked away. They didn't even notice you'd done it, but the post held. He met her eyes. That's why. Eliza was quiet. I don't need beautiful, he said, with a directness that should have been brutal, and somehow wasn't. I don't need impressive. I need someone who sees what's actually in front of them and responds to it, not to how they want it to be or how they think they should respond to it. Just, what's there? He paused. You do that. You barely know me, she said. I know that, he said. That's why I said you have time. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't flinch from it, didn't smile to soften the tension. He simply stood there and let himself be looked at, which she found unexpectedly to be the most honest thing about him. Yes, she said. I'll come. She moved her things to his property on a Thursday. There wasn't much to move. She had her tools, her fabric stores, a small chest of clothing, a set of books she had carried from her mother's house in Missouri and refused to part with despite the weight. Rhett came with a wagon and helped her load it without commentary, and they drove back to his homestead in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not strained either. It was simply the silence of two people who did not yet know each other well enough to know what to say, and had both decided independently that this was not a problem that required immediate solving. He showed her the room. It was at the back of the house, smaller than the front room, but with a good window that faced east and let in the morning light. There was a narrow bed, a table, a chair. He had put a hook on the wall near the door recently. The wood around the screw was still pale and raw. She noticed it and said nothing. He had also left, on the table, a tin of what turned out to be pine salve, the kind useful for cracked hands in cold weather. He didn't explain it. Dinner's on you starting tonight, he said from the doorway. What do you have? He told her. She made an inventory in her head. I can work with that. He nodded and left. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and then she started putting her things away, because standing in rooms having feelings was not a luxury she had ever been able to afford for long. The first week was about learning, not each other, not yet, the house. She walked every inch of it the first day, opening every cabinet and drawer and outbuilding door, taking a mental accounting of what was there, what was depleted, what was in the wrong place for the work it was supposed to support. Rhett watched her do this without interfering, which was the first indication she had that he was serious about what he'd said in the yard, that he actually wanted her assessment, not a performance of agreement. What she found was not neglect so much as the natural consequence of one person managing more than one person could reasonably manage. The food stores were not depleted, but they were badly organized. Slow things where fast things should be, and winter staples stored where they were difficult to reach. The equipment was maintained but scattered. The kitchen had good tools and no system. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about where his priorities lived and was not a judgment, just information. She didn't present him with her findings all at once. She changed one thing at a time, watched whether it worked, and adjusted. When she moved the grain storage from the back of the outbuilding to the near wall, she told him why. She didn't just do it without explanation, because she was in someone else's house and intended to behave as though that mattered. He listened, nodded, and said, "That makes sense." The conversation lasted 30 seconds. It was the most they'd spoken in 3 days. She started on the kitchen garden on her 5th day there, not because it was urgent, but because the soil was showing the first tentative warmth of approaching spring, and if she didn't start the preparation now, she'd lose 2 weeks. She was on her knees breaking ground when she heard hoofbeats on the track. She didn't look up. The horse stopped. She heard a woman's voice, smooth and carrying, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm looking for Rhett Calloway." "He's in the upper pasture," Eliza said, without stopping. "Should be back by midday." A pause. "And you are?" She sat back on her heels and looked up. Clara Whitmore was on a bay mare, wearing a riding dress that was too fine for a working call, and knew it. She was looking at Eliza with an expression that was assembling itself in real time, the initial lack of recognition becoming recognition, then surprise, then something that arranged itself into a careful, brittle pleasantness. "Eliza Thornfield," Eliza said. "Oh," Claire said. Then, "I see." The 2 words did a tremendous amount of work. "I can let him know you called," Eliza offered, "if you'd like to leave a message." Clara looked around the property with the appraising expression of someone calculating value. Her eyes moved over the garden plot, the repaired fence line that Eliza had worked on 2 days ago, the reorganized wood stack beside the house. Something in her expression tightened slightly, too quickly controlled to be comfortable. "No message," she said. "I'll call another time." She turned the horse and rode back down the track. Eliza looked at her retreating back for a moment, then returned to the garden. The settlement's opinion arrived, as it always did, indirectly. She heard it in the way women spoke to her when she went to the trading post for supplies. The particular variety of friendliness that had a thin layer of condescension underneath it, the kind that said, "We are being kind to you, and you should be grateful for the kindness." She heard it in the conversations that paused when she came near and resumed at a slightly different topic when she left. She heard it most clearly from Dorothea Crane, who stopped her on the road 2 weeks after she'd moved to Rhett's property and said, with the kind of sweet directness that was a declaration of war wearing a civil dress, "I do hope you're enjoying yourself up there on the hill, Eliza. It must be such a change from your life in town. Though, I wonder, do you really think you're giving that man what he needs?" Eliza looked at her. Dorothea was wearing a very fine hat and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I think he's a better judge of that than either of us," Eliza said. Dorothea's smile held. Of course he is. Men just sometimes need guidance in understanding what's actually good for them." "He seems to be managing," Eliza said, and walked on. She didn't tell Rhett about that conversation, or most of the ones like it. She didn't tell him about the comment someone had chalked on the post outside the trading post, coarse enough that the owner had painted over it by the next morning, but not before a number of people had seen it. She didn't tell him about the evening she had gone to deliver a repaired coat to the Ferris family and their oldest daughter, who was 14 and had always liked Eliza, pulled her aside and whispered that she'd heard Mrs. Whitmore say at a supper that Rhett would come to his senses within the season. She filed it all away the way she had always filed things. Not forgotten, not stewing, just kept. There would be a time when it mattered. There was always a time when things you'd been keeping started to matter. That's it. The spring that year came in sideways, mean and reluctant, dropping temperatures back to near freezing 2 weeks after it had seemed to relent. The creek at the bottom of Rhett's property ran high and brown with snowmelt, and the road to the settlement became a mud trap that swallowed wagon wheels to the axle without warning. Eliza managed the house through it, stretching supplies further than she'd expected to need to, and finding, in the process, a small satisfaction in the fact that she had organized things well enough that stretching was even possible. If the stores had remained the way she'd found them, they'd have been short by now. She and Rhett had settled into a rhythm that she would not have described as warm, exactly, but that had stopped being awkward. They ate dinner together most nights, and conversation happened naturally. Practical things, mostly. What needed doing, what had happened, the state of the road, the state of the weather. Sometimes he would tell her something about the history of the property, the trappers who had used it before him, the winter he'd spent here alone that he described in sparse terms that suggested it had been harder than he was making it sound. Sometimes she told him about her customers, the small human dramas of the settlement she observed from her particular vantage point of near invisibility. He listened to those stories with more attention than she'd expected, asking occasional questions, turning events over with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "You notice a lot," he said one evening. "I'm usually in the background," she said. "People forget you're there. You hear things. That bothers you." She thought about it honestly. "It used to. Now I mostly think of it as information." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara Whitmore came by again today," he said, "when you were at the Hutchins place." Eliza looked at her hands. "I know. She left tracks in the mud near the east gate." He almost smiled. "She made an offer." "What kind of offer?" "The kind that starts with her family's land and ends with a suggestion that I'm making a mistake." He said it without heat, just as a fact he was relaying. "I told her I wasn't interested. She didn't believe me." "She will eventually," Eliza said. "She might not," he said. "Some people never believe something they didn't decide first." Eliza nodded. She knew that. She had been living inside that particular truth for most of her adult life. "It bothers you," she said, "the way people talk about what you chose." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "What bothers me is that they think I did it without thinking." He set down his fork. "I'm not a man who does things without thinking. It took me 2 years to decide to build this kitchen addition. I spent 4 months watching weather patterns before I moved the water trough. I don't do things without thinking. He met her eyes. When I walked across that yard and stopped in front of you, I knew exactly what I was doing. She held his gaze. Why didn't you just say that to them? I don't explain myself to people who've already decided they know better. She picked up her fork again. After a moment, she said, That's probably wise. He made a sound that might have been agreement or amusement or both. Well, she had been on the property for 6 weeks when the trouble started coming from a more organized direction. The land barons, she had begun to think of them that way, not as an insult but as a category, were 3 men who between them controlled most of the good grazing land on the valley floor and a substantial portion of the water rights that made grazing viable. Their names were Hargrove, Stanek, and a man everyone called Purse, who had a legal name nobody used. They had been the informal authority structure of Blackstone Ridge for the better part of a decade, operating through the particular combination of money, social position, and selective generosity that kept people dependent without being visibly coercive. They had also, she learned slowly, been watching Rhett's property with some interest for approximately 2 years. The property sat at the top of a natural drainage channel. It was worth more for that reason than its acreage suggested. Control of that channel meant influence over water access for 3 properties below it, all of which happened to be adjacent to land. Hargrove and Stanek were interested in consolidating. Rhett had rejected 2 offers to sell, once 2 years ago and once 6 months before Eliza arrived. Neither rejection had apparently been received with particular grace. She learned all of this not from Rhett, who was not a man who volunteered information about past conflicts, but from Mabel and from the Ferris family, and from the careful accumulation of things overheard in the settlement over the course of the 6 weeks she'd been traveling back and forth. She told Rhett what she'd learned one evening in late April, laying it out simply, what she'd heard, from whom, what it suggested about pattern and intention. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. I knew about most of it, he said. I thought you might. You're telling me because you think it's getting worse. I'm telling you because I think they're going to try something that doesn't involve money this time, she said. The 2 cash offers didn't work. They'll change approaches. He looked at her across the table. What do you think they'll try? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but whatever it is, it'll look like something else. That's how they work. Everything looks like something else. He nodded slowly. You've dealt with this kind of thing before. Not this exactly, she said. But the shape of it, yes. He was quiet again. Then, I'll start keeping better records, dates, visitors, anything that moves on the property without explanation. I'll do the same, she said. He nodded, and they returned to their plates, and neither of them mentioned it again that night. But something had shifted between them in the silence, some small incremental thing, like a hinge finding its proper alignment. The ease of 2 people who have discovered, in the middle of something difficult, that they are facing the same direction. The drought announcement came from the regional land office in May, a formal declaration of water shortage status that meant restrictions on draw rights from the creek and new requirements for reporting on usage. It was administrative language, but its practical effect was immediate and stark. Families who had been managing on casual access to water sources suddenly found that access subject to scrutiny, and the scrutiny was being conducted by men who had close relationships with Hargrove and Stanek and Purse. The settlement absorbed it in the slow, grinding way that settlements absorbed bad news, through rumor and argument and a particular kind of worried quiet that settled over conversations like dust. The families with land had more options, the families without, the newer arrivals, the ones still building, the ones whose credit was extended and whose margins were thin, were facing something considerably harder. Eliza watched it happen over the course of 3 trips into town. She watched it in the faces at the trading post, in the conversations at the well, in the way children were quieter and stood closer to their mothers. She watched it in the distribution of anxiety, who had it, who was hiding it, who was performing calm as a social obligation. She started making notes, not for any declared purpose. She didn't have a plan yet. She simply noted what she observed, when she observed it, and let the pattern assemble itself as it chose. It was the same method she used with a difficult piece of fabric. Before she knew what she was going to do, she needed to know what she was working with. What she was working with, as best she could determine, was this: 7 families in particular positions of vulnerability. 3 of them had properties at the end of the water distribution chain. 2 more were new enough to the valley that they had no accumulated goodwill to draw on. The last 2 were women's households: a widow named Ferris with 4 children and Agnes Purdy, who had arrived from somewhere east with more competence than she showed in public, and who Eliza had been quietly watching since their first encounter. She stopped Agnes Purdy on the road one Thursday afternoon in late May and said, without preamble, "I know you're not as uncertain as you're letting people think." Agnes Purdy looked at her with a stillness that confirmed the observation. "Is that so? I think you came here knowing more about what was happening with the land consolidation than most people here have figured out," Eliza said. "And I think you're watching to see who's going to be worth talking to before you say anything out loud." Agnes studied her. "And you're saying you're worth talking to?" "I'm saying I'm trying to figure some things out," Eliza said, "and I think you have information that would help." Agnes looked at the road in both directions. Then she said, "Walk with me, Mud." The drought deepened through June. The creek dropped. The ground cracked. The kitchen garden at Rhett's homestead survived because Eliza had designed the water capture system early and because she got up before dawn most mornings to do the watering before the heat. But the effort it required was significant, and her hands were raw by the end of most days from hauling and rationing and the constant work of making not enough into enough. Rhett watched her manage it with an attention she felt but didn't always see. She would find things, small adjustments, a new barrel positioned where she'd been struggling to reach the water, a repaired handle on the heaviest bucket, a second hook on the wall beside the kitchen door that let her hang the water ladle where she could reach it without bending. He never mentioned these things, neither did she. They both understood by now that acknowledging them would require a vocabulary they hadn't quite assembled yet. He had started coming home from the upper pasture earlier in the evenings. Not dramatically earlier, so it wasn't a change that announced itself. But she noticed it, the way she noticed everything about the rhythm of the house. And she filed it away with the pine salve and the hook by the door, and the barrel moved to the right position. One evening, near the end of June, they were sitting on the porch in the blue light after dinner, and he said, without looking at her, "You're doing more than we agreed." She looked at the hills. "I'm doing what needs doing." "That's not what I said." She was quiet. "The Ferris widow," he said. "You've been helping her with her water usage. I heard about it from Hartley. She has 4 children and a failing storage system. It took me about 2 hours to fix." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not criticizing you. I know. He stopped, started again. "I told you when you came that I don't need constant conversation, that I don't need company for its own sake. That's still true. But I want you to know that I see what you're doing, not just here, out there." He made a small gesture toward the settlement in the valley below. "I see it." She looked at him. In the fading light, with the worry about the drought and the land barons and the 7 families visible in the lines of his face alongside the other, older lines, he looked like a man carrying something heavy and doing it without complaint. She understood that look. She had worn it herself for long enough to recognize it from the outside. "Rhett," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for this." She meant the house, the room with the key, the 30-second conversations that had turned into something else over 6 weeks, the barrel in the right position, the fact that when he had walked across a yard in front of 400 people and stopped in front of her, he had meant it. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said simply, "You've been worth every word of it." The evening deepened around them. Somewhere below in the valley, the settlement was settling into its own nighttime quiet. Fires banked, animals settled, people lying in the dark wondering whether the rain would come. Up on the hill, on the porch of a house that had started becoming something neither of them had known they were building, 2 people sat in the particular comfortable silence of those who have, without quite deciding to, begun to trust each other. The drought continued, the pressure continued, and Eliza Thornfield, seamstress, overlooked, unmistakable, kept her notes and tended her garden and watched the shape of things come slowly, inevitably clear. The rain Agnes Purdy had been predicting since their first conversation finally came in the second week of July. Not the slow, soaking kind the valley needed, but a single hard night of it that ran off the cracked ground faster than it could be absorbed and left the creek briefly swollen and the next morning bone dry again. The farmers watched the sky afterward with the particular expression of people who have been handed something and then had it taken back, and the conversations at the trading post returned to the drought with a renewed bitterness. Eliza had, by this point, a clearer picture of the situation than most people in the settlement were willing to assemble out loud. Agnes had been careful with her information, not withholding, but deliberate, the way a woman who has been burned before handles anything valuable. What she shared came out over 3 separate conversations, walking the road to the settlement and back, and what it amounted to was this. The drought restrictions on water draw rights were not being applied evenly. Families whose properties were adjacent to Hargrove's interests were receiving informal extensions, delays in enforcement, accommodating interpretations of the new regulations. Families whose properties were not useful to those interests were receiving something considerably more rigid. The land office man, Agnes said, on their third walk. His name is Decker. He has dinner at Hargrove's house twice a month, has done for 2 years. Who else knows this? Plenty of people know, Agnes said. Nobody's saying it where it can be heard. Eliza turned this over. Why did you come here? To Blackstone Ridge, specifically? Agnes was quiet for a long moment. I had a property. Back east. I lost it through exactly this kind of arrangement. Men who smiled at you in the street and ate your food when you invited them and were systematically transferring your title to themselves the whole time. She kept her eyes on the road. I came here because I heard it was starting to happen here too. I thought, she stopped. I thought if I could see it forming from the beginning, maybe I could do something about it before it finished. Can you? By myself? Agnes shook her head. No. Eliza nodded, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. She didn't tell Rhett all of it that night. She told him the core of it, Decker, the dinner arrangements, the pattern of selective enforcement, and watched his face as she did. He sat at the kitchen table with his elbows on the wood and his hands folded under his chin, and the expression he wore was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who has had a suspicion confirmed and finds the confirmation worse than the suspicion. Decker signed off on our water draw rights in March, he said. I know. He could revoke them. He could try, she said, but we've been documenting our usage carefully. He'd need a reason that holds up. Rhett looked at her. You've been keeping records. Since April. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me you were doing that. I didn't want to say it until I knew what I had. She met his eyes. I'm telling you now. He unfolded his hands, sat back. What do you need from me? She had been thinking about this. Nothing yet, but I want to start talking to the families on the vulnerable list, not formally, not with anything that looks like organizing, just being present, making sure they know there's someone paying attention. They'll talk, he said. Hargrove's people will notice. Yes, she said, but talking and proving are different things. I've been doing invisible work for 3 years in this settlement. I know how to move around in it without announcing myself. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't admiration exactly, more like the recognition you give to a skill you understand the cost of. All right, he said. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing different. Keep working the property the way you have been. Be seen. Be normal. She paused. Don't get into any arguments with Hargrove's people if you can avoid it. They're looking for a reason to make you look unstable. A muscle moved in his jaw. I don't pick fights. I know you don't, but they might try to arrange one. He held her gaze for a long moment. You think about things a lot, he said, not as a criticism, more like a man noting something he hadn't previously accounted for. I've had time, she said simply. I've been thinking my way around problems since I was 12 years old. It's what I have. He nodded, and they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a July night with the drought lying over the valley below them, and neither of them spoke for a while. But it was the comfortable kind of silence now, the kind that had room for both of them in it. The cruelty, when it came through the women. She had expected the men to be the primary engine of it. The snide comments at the trading post, the deliberate slights at community gatherings, the pressure applied through Rhett's professional relationships. and some of that happened. But the sharper, more consistent edge came from the social world that women controlled in the settlement, the world of calls and gatherings and communal work, the invisible architecture of who was included and who was not, who received information and who was kept peripheral to it. She was excluded from things she hadn't been explicitly included in before. That part was simply a continuation of what had always been true. What changed was that the exclusion became deliberate rather than passive. It stopped being the natural invisibility of a plain, unmarried seamstress and became something with an intention behind it. Women who had used her services for years began finding reasons to go to the seamstress in the next settlement over. The communal canning session in August, which she had participated in every year she'd been in Blackstone Ridge, simply did not have an invitation delivered to her address. She heard about it 3 days before and then chose, calmly and deliberately, not to ask why. Clara Whitmore was the organizing intelligence behind most of it, though she was too clever to be its visible face. Clara operated through suggestion and social pressure the way a skilled weaver operates through a loom. The structure did the work, and she was the hand that threaded it. Eliza had watched enough of the settlement's social mechanics to trace the pattern. The particular way rumors bent toward Clara's interests. The way women who spent time in her company arrived at opinions that had Clara's fingerprints on them without quite being her words. Dorothea Crane was more direct. She stopped Eliza in the trading post on a Thursday in late July and said, loud enough for the 3 women nearest to hear, "You know, Eliza, I think it's admirable that you've made yourself useful up there. Really, I do. A woman with your limitations has to work with what she has." Eliza set her purchases on the counter. "Dorothea," she said, "how is your south pasture fence holding up? I heard it was giving trouble." Dorothea blinked. What?" "The southeast corner post, the one that shifts when the ground dries out." She kept her voice pleasant. "You might want to get someone to look at it before the next hard wind. The whole section will come down otherwise, and that's an expensive repair once it goes." Dorothea stared at her. "How do you know about my fence?" "I pass it when I come to town," Eliza said. "I notice things." She picked up her basket. "Good afternoon." She heard, as she walked out, the low stir of voices behind her, the specific sound of people recalibrating a story they'd already decided on. It was a small thing. It didn't solve anything, but it felt, walking out into the dry July heat, like something she needed. Rhett found out about the canning session not from her but from Harlan Voss, who mentioned it in passing while Rhett was at the trading post for supplies, and he came home that evening with a tightness around his jaw that she recognized as the outer edge of real anger, carefully held. "You didn't tell me about the canning," he said. She was at the table mending a shirt. She didn't stop. "There was nothing to tell. They didn't invite me. I didn't go." "That's been happening," he said. "People turning their backs on you. I've been hearing things." "You've been hearing the ordinary behavior of people who think I don't belong here," she said. "It's nothing new." "It's new in degree." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "I don't like it." She looked up from the shirt. His face had that particular intensity that she had come to understand was not temper, or not only temper, but something else underneath it, something more personal. "What are you going to do about it?" "I want to say something," he said. "At the next community meeting, set it straight." "Rhett." She set down the shirt. "If you stand up at a community meeting and tell people to be kinder to your wife, what happens?" He was quiet. "They laugh," she said, "or they smile politely and go on exactly as before. Except now they also think you're soft. And then the men who are looking for a lever to use on you have one." She picked the shirt back up. "What helps me is not a speech. What helps me is time." "Time," he repeated, like the word frustrated him. "People change their minds when they see something that contradicts what they've decided," she said. "You can't argue them into it. They have to see it themselves." She found the hole in the seam she'd been working toward. "I've been waiting my whole life for people to see things themselves. I'm reasonably patient about it by now." He looked at her for a long moment. "It bothers you more than you're showing." She threaded the needle. "Yes." "Then let it," he said. "You don't have to perform not caring around me." She held very still for a moment. Then she set the shirt down again and looked at the table and said quietly, "It does bother me. The canning session bothered me. Dorothea Crane's little speeches bother me. Not because I need their approval. I stopped needing that a long time ago. But because there's something tiring about being the person everyone's already decided doesn't count. You have to work twice as hard for half as much. And some days that's just—" She stopped. "Exhausting," he said. "Yes." He put his hand on the table, not reaching for hers, just placing it there, open, about halfway between them. "I know I chose this," he said. "I knew what I was doing, and I'd do it the same again. But I'm sorry you have to carry the parts that come from them not understanding it." She looked at his hand on the table, then she reached across and put hers over it, just briefly, a few seconds. Then she picked up the shirt and went back to work. "Tell me what you heard at the trading post today," she said. "About the water draw situation." He exhaled slowly, settling back into the practical, the manageable, the work in front of them. "Decker's called a meeting, 2 weeks out. He's going to announce the second round of usage restrictions." Eliza's hands slowed. "Who does it hit hardest? Ferris' widow, the Parton brothers, and—" He paused. "Lena Marsh and her son. You know the Marshes?" She knew the Marshes. Lena Marsh was 61 years old and had built her property with her husband over 30 years, and her husband had been dead for 2. And her son was 19 and working twice as hard as a 19-year-old should have to, and still falling behind. "Yes," she said. "I know the Marshes. If the second restrictions hit them the way the first ones hit them, they lose the property," she said. "Within the season," he confirmed. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the July night was still and hot and dry, the stars hard and clear overhead, the valley below dark except for scattered lights. Somewhere down there, Lena Marsh was probably awake in her own kitchen, running the same numbers and arriving at the same sum. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. She set the finished shirt aside and picked up the next one and began, in the part of her mind that was always working, to think about what 2 weeks meant and what could be built inside it and what would need to be different on the other side. What she built in those 2 weeks was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no declarations, no visible confrontations. What there was instead was Eliza Thornfield moving through Blackstone Ridge the way she always had, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to herself. And in that movement, things shifted. She visited Lena Marsh on a Tuesday with a practical reason for the call, a pattern she'd promised to bring over, and stayed for 2 hours. What they talked about initially was the pattern, and then the drought, and then the water situation, and then gradually the specifics of Lena's usage records and the gaps in them that made her vulnerable to Decker's enforcement. Eliza had brought her own record-keeping templates. She had made several copies over the past week, clean and organized, the kind that would hold up under scrutiny. She left them with Lena and explained how to fill them in. She did the same with the Parton brothers, who were less organized and more suspicious, but came around when she made clear she wasn't asking for anything in return and wasn't operating as anyone's representative. She did it with 2 other families on her list. She did it with Agnes, who already had good records but helped her understand the specific legal language of the usage restrictions well enough to identify where the enforcement was being selectively applied. At the Ferris household, the oldest daughter, 15 now, named Cora, caught Eliza's arm as she was leaving and said low and urgent, "Mrs. Calloway, I heard Hargrove say something at the hardware store. He said after Decker's meeting, he's going to move on the Calloway water rights. He said he has a way to do it that can't be fought." Eliza kept her expression still. "What way?" He didn't say, but the man he was talking to laughed and said it was a good plan. She walked home up the hill that evening in the cooling dusk, turning it over. A way that can't be fought. She knew what that meant on the frontier. It meant paperwork. It meant something buried in the land office records, something that looked legitimate from the outside, that would take longer to unravel than most people had time or money for. It meant they were going to move before she had time to build anything solid enough to stop them. She was halfway up the track when she heard hoofbeats coming down toward her. Rhett pulled up the horse and looked at her face and said, without preamble, "What happened?" "Ride back down with me," she said. "I need to go see Agnes Purdy tonight." He swung down from his horse and walked beside her, leading it by the reins, and she told him what Cora had said. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, the way she had learned to value above almost everything else about him, the complete unperforming attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a beat. Then, "If they move on the water rights—" "We have the records," she said. "We have the documentation, but it won't be enough if they've already filed something that contradicts it." "How fast can they move?" "Before Decker's meeting, if they're planning to use the meeting as cover," she said. "That's what I think they're going to do. Announce the restrictions, create the noise, and file whatever they've been preparing while everyone's focused on the announcement." Rhett stopped walking. She stopped too. He was looking at the valley below them, at the lights of the settlement spread out in the early dark, and something moved across his face that she recognized as the moment a man stops calculating and starts deciding. "I know someone at the county land office," he said. "Not Decker. Someone above Decker." She looked at him. "You've been holding that." "I've been holding it because using it is a last resort," he said. "It calls in something that can't be put back." He looked at her. "This is the last resort." She held his gaze. Around them the hill was quiet, the grass dry and pale in the last light, the horse patient beside him. "Yes," she said, "it is." He nodded. "I'll ride out tomorrow morning." She started walking again. After a moment he fell back into step beside her, horse trailing behind them both. The track was steep, and the ground was hard, and the valley lay below them with all its accumulated pressure and history, and the small, stubborn lights of people who were still, despite everything, trying to hold on. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Rhett said quietly, "You know, when I walked across that yard in the spring, you said you'd thought it through," she said. "I had," he said. "But I didn't know it would be like this." She glanced at him. "Is that a complaint?" He was quiet for a moment. Something settled in his face, not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. "No," he said, "it's not." They walked the rest of the way up in the dark together, and the settlement below them did not know what was coming, and neither, quite, did they. But they were moving toward it side by side. And for now, that was the thing that mattered most. Rhett left before dawn. Eliza heard him moving through the house in the dark. The particular careful sounds of a man trying not to wake someone, boots set down instead of dropped, the back door eased shut instead of pulled. She lay still and listened to the horse's hooves on the dry track, growing quieter, then gone. And then the hill was silent, except for the usual nothing of a summer night without enough wind. She got up at first light and went to work. There was a specific quality to the next 4 days that she would remember for a long time afterward. Not the feeling of waiting, exactly, because she was not the kind of person who waited well or willingly, but the feeling of moving through ordinary tasks with an awareness of something gathering at the edge of things. She managed the house, tended the garden, made her rounds to the families on her list, stitched 2 commission pieces that she delivered without incident. Everything on the surface was the same. Underneath it, the whole valley felt like a cord pulled tight. Rhett came back on his 4th evening looking like a man who had ridden hard and slept badly, and was not particularly interested in talking about either of those things. He ate the dinner she'd kept warm, drank 2 cups of coffee, and then sat back and told her what he'd found. His contact at the county land office was a man named Aldous Webb, not a friend, more accurately described as a man who owed Rhett a debt of the kind that doesn't expire, from an incident 3 years prior that Rhett explained in brief and without embellishment. Webb had access to the active filing records. What Rhett had confirmed was worse than the worst version Eliza had been carrying in the back of her mind. There were not 1 but 3 separate filings in preparation. One challenged the water draw rights on Rhett's property on the basis of a surveying discrepancy from the original title, a discrepancy that had been there since the property was first registered and had never been acted on, because nobody had ever needed to act on it until now. The second was a nuisance complaint against the Parton brothers that was thin enough to be laughable, but dense enough in legal language to require an expensive response. The third was the one that made Eliza's stomach tighten, a quiet reclassification request on Lena Marsh's water access, filed not through the drought restrictions process, but through an obscure secondary channel that most people at the land office didn't even know existed. Agnes had told her about that channel. It was the one Hargrove had used before. When are they filing? She said. Webb thinks within the week, before Decker's meeting, like you said. Can Webb delay them? He can lose a form for a few days, Rhett said. That's all. And losing it costs him something. She was quiet, working through it. 4 days. Maybe 5. That's enough. He looked at her. For what? I have an idea, she said. But I need Agnes. And I need Cora Ferris's father. And I need you to not argue with me about the part you're not going to like. He set down his coffee cup. Tell me the whole thing. She told him. He listened. He did not argue, though she could see the part he didn't like moving through his expression. He was not a man who enjoyed being told to stay visible while someone else went into the difficult territory. But he understood the reasoning, and he trusted her enough now to accept it. All right, he said, but if it goes wrong, we deal with what's actually there, she said. Not what we were afraid might be there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. They had 3 days before the weather changed everything. In those 3 days, Eliza moved through the settlement with a focused, quiet efficiency that she would not have been able to manage 6 months earlier, because 6 months earlier she had not known these people the way she knew them now, had not built the particular credit of small, reliable actions that made them willing to listen. She talked to the families, not with speeches, but with specific information. Here is what is being filed. Here is the channel being used. Here's the legal language that makes it look legitimate when it isn't. Agnes helped her translate the bureaucratic complexity into plain terms. Cora's father, a carpenter named Walt Ferris, who had the kind of blunt practical authority that comes from being reliably competent for 20 years, helped her understand which of the affected families would act and which would freeze. Most of them were frightened. That was the honest assessment. The Parton brothers were angry enough to be useful, but underneath the anger was the same fear that was in everyone else, the fear of men who knew that the people opposing them had more money, more connections, and more time than they did. Fear was reasonable. Fear was the correct response to the situation. Eliza was not interested in telling people not to be afraid. She was interested in giving them something specific to do with the fear. You don't need to win this in the open, she told Lena Marsh, sitting at the woman's kitchen table on the second day. You just need to make it cost more than it's worth. If filing against you becomes complicated, public, slow, they move to easier targets. That's how this kind of operation works. They're not interested in a fight, they're interested in acquisition. Lena's hands were clasped on the table. They were the hands of a woman who had worked outdoors for 30 years, rough, strong, permanently stained at the knuckles. What if they don't back off? What if they just push harder? Then we have more than we have now, Eliza said. I won't tell you this is certain. I'll tell you it's better than doing nothing. Lena looked at her for a long moment. Why are you doing this? It's not your property at risk. Eliza considered the question honestly. It was going to be, she said. The filing against our water rights says that's part of the same operation. If they succeed with the others, they come for ours next. She paused. And also, she stopped. Tried again. I know what it costs to lose something you built. I know it from a different kind of losing, but I know the shape of it. I don't want to watch it happen if I can do something about it. Lena held her gaze. Then she unclenched her hands, picked up a pen, and said, Show me what to sign. The fire started on the third night. Nobody saw where it began. That was the first thing people said afterward, over and over, as though the origin point mattered more than what it became. The origin point was somewhere in the dry timber on the eastern slope, a lightning strike from the single brief storm that rolled through in the hour before midnight, or an unattended fire, or something else that people speculated about for months. What mattered was what it became in the first 2 hours, fed by the drought-dry brush and the August wind that came in from the northwest with terrible helpfulness. A wall of fire moving across the eastern face of Blackstone Ridge with a speed that no one had planned for, because no one had imagined needing to plan for it. Eliza smelled it before she heard anything. She was awake. She had been awake for an hour, lying in the dark with the week's accumulated tension refusing to let her sleep. And the smell came through the open window sharp and wrong. Not the usual nighttime wood smoke of banked fires, but something bigger and angrier underneath it. She was out of bed and at the window before she'd fully formed the thought. The eastern sky had an orange quality that had nothing to do with sunrise. She went to Rhett's door and knocked twice, hard. Fire, east slope. Get up. She heard him move immediately. No confusion, no delay. By the time she had her boots on and was at the back door, he was behind her, and they both stood on the porch for the 3 seconds it took to understand the scale of what they were looking at. The fire was not on the far edge of the ridge. It was moving. "The Ferris place is in the direct path," she said. "So is the Marsh property," he said. They looked at each other in the orange-lit dark. "The settlement," she said. "We have to get people moving." He was already going for the horse. She went on foot down the track at a pace she hadn't known she could sustain, and by the time she reached the first outlying property, the alarm bell at the trading post was already ringing. Someone else had seen the sky, thank God. Or not God, thank whatever makes people look up when they should. Lights were coming on. She could hear voices, the specific chaotic quality of people who have been frightened awake and have not yet organized their fear into anything useful. The scene at the trading post was what she had expected, and worse than she'd hoped. 24 people in various states of undress, some of them with children, voices overlapping, questions with no answers. Harlan Voss was trying to establish some kind of authority over the noise and failing. Walt Ferris had arrived and was looking at the sky with the expression of a man making a calculation he didn't like. Hargrove's man, a heavy-set foreman named Clyde, was standing with a group of the wealthier property owners near the far wall, gesturing toward the south road and talking loudly about a firebreak. She found Agnes first. Agnes was standing at the edge of the crowd with a child on her hip. A neighbor's child, not hers. Someone had handed the baby to her and apparently forgotten to take it back. She was looking at the sky the same way Walt Ferris was looking at it. And when she saw Eliza, she said immediately, "The south road is blocked. A tree came down on it an hour ago in the wind. I heard it from my window." Eliza stopped. "You're certain?" "I heard it, and I went and looked. It's down across the whole width." Clyde's group was still talking about the south road. Eliza looked at them, then at the fire, then at the canyon mouth visible from the edge of the trading post clearing. The old Trapper's Canyon, the one that cut through the northern ridge and came out onto the flat ground beyond, the route that the older families in the valley knew about, and the newer ones had never needed to learn. The problem with the canyon was that it was narrow and partially collapsed in one section from a rockfall 3 winters ago, and it required crossing a dry creek bed that was currently not dry. The brief storm that had started the fire had put water in it, fast-moving water over unstable ground. It was not a good route. It was not a safe route. It was the only route. Rhett found her in the crowd, and she told him about the south road. "The canyon," he said. It was not a question. He had lived here long enough to know the same geography. "The creek is running," she said. "I know." "We'd have to get everyone through a creek crossing in the dark with the fire moving." "Yes," he said. "Can the canyon passage handle wagons?" He thought about it for 2 seconds. "One at a time. The narrow section is about 40 feet, single file." "How long does that take?" "Longer than we have if we stand here arguing about it," he said. She turned toward the crowd. What happened next was not heroic in the way she would have written it if she were writing it. She didn't climb onto a barrel and make a speech that silenced the crowd and turned panic into order. What she did was find the 4 people she'd built trust with over the past 8 weeks: Walt Ferris, Agnes, Lena Marsh, who had arrived in the last 5 minutes wrapped in a coat over her nightgown, and a young man named Tomas Reyes, whose family had a property adjacent to the canyon entrance. And she told each of them one specific thing. Walt, keep people moving, don't let anyone stop to argue. Agnes, account for the families with children, make sure none of them are left behind. Lena, the older folks who might resist, she would know them, she would talk to them. Tomas, he knew the canyon entrance better than anyone. He was going first. He was the guide. What about the South Road group? Rhett said, low beside her. Clyde is still selling it. She looked at the group. They were still talking, but something in the body language had shifted. The fire was louder now, a sound she had not registered until this moment, because she had been too focused to hear it, a low, constant roar underneath the wind that had gotten bigger in the last 10 minutes. Some of the people in that group were starting to look at each other instead of at Clyde. Leave them, she said. He looked at her. They have to make their own choice, she said. We can't drag them. We don't have the time. She felt the hardness of it as she said it, the specific weight of knowing that some people would refuse a thing that would save them because they didn't want to believe they needed saving by this particular person. We get everyone who will come. We go now." Rhett turned to face the crowd. He wasn't a man who raised his voice often. She had noticed that about him, the way he used volume sparingly, so that when it came, it had actual weight. When he spoke now, it cut through the noise the way a clean axe cut through wood, not with force, exactly, but with precision. "South Road is blocked," he said. "If you go that way, you're driving into a dead end." He waited one beat for that to land. "We're going through the North Canyon. Anyone coming? Come now." Silence for about 4 seconds. Then Walt Ferris said, "I'm coming," and that was apparently enough, because people began to move. Not everyone. That was the truth of it. Clyde's group held 5 or 6 of the wealthier men and their families, who had made the calculation that Rhett Calloway and his overlooked wife were not the kind of people whose judgment should determine their survival. Clara Whitmore was among them, pale and composed, watching with an expression that Eliza could not read from 20 feet away. There was no time to try. The canyon at night was a different world than the canyon in daylight. She had walked it twice during the day, taking her own assessment of the route in the weeks before any of this started, because she had learned long ago to know the terrain she might someday need. At night, with 34 people and 11 horses and 4 wagons, and the fire's orange light giving everything a moving, unreliable shadow, it was close to disorienting. The narrow section was 40 feet, as Rhett had said. It was 40 feet of rock wall on both sides, maybe 6 feet across, with the ground uneven and the passage angled in a way that made wagon wheels catch on the left wall if you didn't compensate for it. Thomas went through first with a lantern. Then Rhett guided the first wagon. The Marsh families, Lena's son at the reins, Lena herself sitting beside him with her hands gripping the seatboard. The wagon made it through in 4 minutes that felt considerably longer than 4 minutes, the wheel catching twice and requiring Rhett to physically hold it clear. Behind them, Eliza moved along the waiting line, checking. A child crying somewhere in the middle of the group. She found the family, took a moment to confirm they were all there, and the child was frightened but uninjured. An older man from the Yates family who was moving too slowly and beginning to look glassy-eyed with shock. She put his arm through Walt Ferris's and told Walt to keep moving, keep him moving, don't let him stop. Agnes had the children group organized with a quiet competence that Eliza would have admired more if she'd had the time. The fire was closer. She could feel the heat of it on the back of her neck when she stood at the canyon entrance watching the line move, a warmth that had no business being there at midnight. The roaring sound had become continuous. Above the canyon mouth, the sky was the color of something that should not be a sky color. The second wagon, the third, a horse that balked at the narrow section and had to be blindfolded with someone's jacket before it would go through. 3 minutes lost, possibly 4. The fourth wagon lost a wheel pin in the narrow section, and for 60 seconds it was completely blocking the passage, and people behind it were beginning to make sounds that were close to panic. And Rhett was at the front of it, and Tomas was at the rear, and she was standing in the middle of the group saying, clearly and without urgency in her voice, "It's moving. Hold where you are. It's moving." Because the worst thing that could happen right now was the back of the group deciding it was over and turning around. The wagon moved. They came out the other side of the canyon onto the flat ground beyond the ridge at a few minutes past 2 in the morning, and Eliza counted them as they came out. Not precisely, she had not had time to count precisely before they started, but she knew the families and she knew the faces, and she moved through the group when they stopped, looking. The Parton brothers, the Reyes family, Lena Marsh and her son, Agnes with 3 children who were not her own, Walt Ferris with the glassy-eyed Yates man who had come back to himself and was sitting on the ground looking at his hands. 27, 28, 30, 32, 34. 34 people had gone in. 34 people were standing on the flat ground on the far side of the canyon. She sat down on a rock because her legs decided, without consulting her, that they were done for the moment. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, slightly surprised, and pressed them flat against her knees until they stopped. Rhett came and stood beside her. He was covered in dust and there was a long scrape along his right forearm, where he'd caught the canyon wall in the dark, bleeding slowly. She looked at it. "It's fine," he said. "It needs to be cleaned. Later." She looked back at the canyon mouth, at the orange sky above the ridge. Somewhere behind that wall of rock, the fire was doing what fires did, taking what the drought had given it and making it into something permanent. Behind that wall, also, a group of people had chosen a different path, convinced by a man who spoke with the authority of money and position and had been wrong. She didn't know yet what had happened to them. She wouldn't know until morning. "You did that," Rhett said. She shook her head. "We did that." "No." He was looking at the group of 34 people settling onto the flat ground, children being held, hands being held. The particular quiet of people who have come through something and haven't quite processed it yet. "I got them moving. You knew where to go." She looked at the group, too. Lena Marsh had her son's head pulled against her shoulder, his face tucked down the way a grown man's face goes when he stops pretending he wasn't frightened. The Parton brothers were sitting on the ground back to back, saying nothing. Thomas Reyes had his lantern in his lap and was staring at the flame inside the glass, the way people stared at small stable things, after large unstable things. She thought about the South Road, about Clyde's group still back there, about Clara Whitmore's unreadable expression. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll know more tomorrow." Rhett sat down beside her on the rock, not touching, just present, the weight of him there in the dark beside her, solid and tired and real. Around them, the flat ground held 34 people who were alive because a route existed that most of them had not known about. Tended and considered by a woman most of them had not thought about much at all. The fire burned on. The night passed slowly, and Eliza Thornfield sat in the dark and did not let herself think yet about what came next, because what came next would require everything she had, and right now she needed to sit still for just a few minutes and let herself be a person who had been frightened and was not finished being frightened before she had to be anything else. Morning came in gray and slow. The sky above the ridge the color of old ash. The smell of smoke embedded in everything, clothes, hair, the ground itself. The 34 people who had spent the night on the flat ground beyond the canyon woke stiffly from improvised sleep, children disoriented, adults moving with the careful deliberateness of those whose bodies had registered the previous night more fully than their minds had yet caught up with. Eliza had not slept. She had sat on the rock for a while, then moved to help with the children, then simply walked the perimeter of the group in the dark, because sitting still had stopped being possible. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had taken a full accounting of their situation, who had injuries, minor ones mostly, scrapes and one twisted ankle from the canyon crossing, and what they had with them in terms of food and water, which was not much. The families had left quickly and in the dark. Nobody had thought to pack provisions for an open-air night on the far side of a ridge. Rhett had the same assessment by dawn. He came to her with it without being asked. This was one of the things she had noticed about him over the months, the way he arrived at the same conclusions through a parallel process and then reported in, two people running different calculations and arriving at compatible answers. "We need to get them moving toward Carver's Creek settlement," he said. "It's 8 miles. We have enough horses and wagons to carry those who can't walk the full distance. The canyon might be passable on foot by now," she said, "if the fire moved east the way the wind was pushing it. I'll go look. Be careful." He went. She organized the group for departure, working with Walt Ferris and Agnes, getting people fed on what was available, dried meat from one of the wagon supplies, water from a spring that Tomas had located the previous night 50 yards from where they'd stopped. It was not enough, but it was something. The children ate first. Nobody argued about that. Rhett came back in 40 minutes. "The canyon's passable," he said. "The fire went east like you said. The south slope is burned, but the passage is clear." He paused. "The settlement took damage on the eastern edge, 3 structures gone, but the main body of it is standing." She exhaled slowly. "And the South Road group?" He didn't answer immediately. She looked at him. "They made it to the creek," he said. "All of them. But the road was blocked worse than Agnes said. They couldn't get the wagons through. They ended up abandoning them and going overland. Hargrove's operation on the east pasture is gone. The whole structure burned." He paused again, and she could hear the thing he was managing in his voice. "Clyde's trying to say he led them to safety. Clara Whitmore set him straight, apparently, loudly." Eliza absorbed this. Was anyone hurt in their group? One man with a bad burn on his arm, not life-threatening. He met her eyes. "They all made it, Eliza. Both groups made it." She nodded. The relief in that was complicated. She had made peace with the possibility, somewhere in the dark of the previous night, that not everyone would get out. She had understood when she'd said, "We can't drag them," that she was accepting a risk she didn't control. The fact that it had resolved the way it had was real, and she let herself feel it for a moment before she put it in the place where she kept things that were finished and needed to stay finished. "Then we go back," she said. "What not?" What they returned to was not the settlement they had left. The eastern edge of Blackstone Ridge looked like a mouth with teeth knocked out. 3 properties reduced to foundations and ash, a 4th with half its structures standing and half gone. The trading post had survived intact, and the main road, and most of the residential cluster in the settlement's center. But the eastern approach was raw and black and still faintly smoking in the morning air, and the smell of it sat over everything like a weight that would take weeks to lift. The reunification of the 2 groups happened in the open ground near the trading post, and it was not graceful. People were exhausted and frightened, and some of them were angry in the way people get angry after fear passes, looking for a place to put what they'd been carrying. Clyde made one attempt to reframe the South Road decision as strategic, and Walt Ferris told him to shut his mouth with a directness that ended the conversation permanently. Hargrove himself had not appeared. His east pasture operation was ash. Whatever the fire had not taken, the night had. The particular look of a man whose position has shifted under him without his permission was visible on the faces of the people associated with his interests, a new uncertainty around the eyes, a recalibration happening in real time. Eliza did not participate in any of that. She had the Reyes family's wagon, and she was moving supplies from it to the Ferris place, which had sustained minor structural damage on the north corner and needed shoring up before the next weather came through. This was the work that was in front of her, so she did it. It was Lena Marsh who came to find her, an hour after they'd returned, while she was on her knees examining the Ferris Foundation. "People are talking about what you did," Lena said. Eliza sat back on her heels. "People are talking about a lot of things right now. Not the way they usually talk." Lena looked at her with an expression that was direct and slightly uncomfortable, the expression of a woman who had changed her understanding of something and was deciding whether to say so out loud. "The canyon, the route, the families you visited. You had us ready before any of this started. The records, the legal preparations. People are putting it together. To shet a mut ours. Watson." "Agnes helped with the records," Eliza said. "Walt kept people moving. Tomas knew the canyon." "They all had their part," Lena said. "So did you." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know what I said before. When you came to my house and I asked you why you were helping me, I want you to know I understood the answer before you gave it. I just needed to hear it." Eliza looked at her. "I spent 30 years on that property thinking I understood what mattered," Lena said. "I understood working. I understood enduring. But I had a blind spot about who was worth paying attention to. I didn't see you because I wasn't looking." She held Eliza's gaze. "I'm looking now." Eliza didn't have a response to that, or not an easy one. She said, "Your South Pasture water storage is going to need reinforcement before fall. The drought stressed the retaining wall. I can come look at it next week if you want." Lena made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. "I do want," she said. "Yes, Wab." The legal situation resolved itself with a speed that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with calculation. When Rhett's contact Aldous Webb learned about the fire and the damaged properties and the story of the canyon route that was already moving through the settlement, he sent a short letter through the county mail. The letter contained 2 sentences. The first said that the surveying discrepancy in the Callaway property title had been reviewed and found to be within acceptable historical variance. The second said that the pending filings associated with properties in the Blackstone Ridge water draw district had been returned for procedural revision and would require resubmission with additional documentation. It was not a declaration of victory. It was a bureaucratic retreat, the quiet withdrawal of a hand that had reached too far and found the air changed around it. Rhett read the letter twice, handed it to Eliza, and said nothing for a moment. "They're not giving up," she said. "They're regrouping." "I know." He leaned on the table. "But regrouping takes time, and things are different now." She knew what he meant. The fire had done something to the social mathematics of Blackstone Ridge that 6 months of careful preparation hadn't fully accomplished. It had created a shared experience of the kind that stripped away pretense. People who had been operating inside comfortable hierarchies of status and influence had spent a night in the dark without those hierarchies mattering, and some of them were not quite able to put them back on the way they'd worn them before. Hargrove showed up at the trading post 3 days after the fire. He was accompanied by Stanek, and both men had the careful expressions of people who had made a decision about how to behave and were executing it with discipline. Hargrove bought supplies, spoke to 3 or 4 people, and was leaving when he and Eliza came face to face near the door. He was a tall man, big through the middle, with a handshake that he used as a measure of other men, and eyes that appraised everything, the way a livestock buyer appraised at auction. He had never spoken directly to Eliza before. He looked at her now with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not contempt, but not respect either. Something assessing. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I hear you know the North Canyon well," he said. "Saved a number of families." "A number of people saved a number of families," she said. "It was a group effort." He was quiet for a moment, still looking at her with that appraising expression. "Your husband has a good property up there," he said. "Good water access." "He does," she said. "I've made offers before," he said. "Neither of them went well." "No," she agreed. A brief pause. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a decision, more like the approach to one. "I'm not a man who repeats himself unnecessarily," he said. "But I want you to know I'm aware of the full picture now, of who you are and what happened." He said it with the particular tone of a man who had rehearsed the sentence and was not fully comfortable with it. "The filings have been withdrawn." "I know," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then nodded once and left. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he'd gone, watching him walk to his horse. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and cautious and aware that a man who had not gotten what he wanted was not the same as a man who had stopped wanting it. But the territory between them had shifted, and both of them knew it, and that was not nothing. Agnes appeared at her elbow. "How'd that go?" "He told me the filings are withdrawn," Eliza said. "I know. He told Stanek first, and Stanek told Lena, and Lena told Walt, and Walt told me." Agnes paused. "The speed of information in this settlement is genuinely impressive when the subject is interesting enough." Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. "What do you think he'll do next?" "Nothing for a while," Agnes said. "He needs to recalculate. The fire changed the math." She glanced at Eliza. "You changed the math." "We did," Eliza said again, and this time Agnes let it stand. Clara Whitmore came to the house on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the fire. She rode up the track on the bay mare, the same horse from the first visit in spring, and this time she tied it at the gate herself and walked to the door and knocked. Eliza opened it. They looked at each other. "I'd like to come in," Clara said. Eliza stepped back. Clara came in and stood in the kitchen with the particular stiffness of a woman who had prepared herself carefully for something and was now confronting the difference between preparation and the thing itself. She was wearing a dress that was fine but not ornate. A concession, Eliza understood, a signal. She looked at the kitchen, at the organized shelves and the repaired window frame and the herbs drying above the stove, and her expression moved through several registers before settling into something more neutral. "You should know," Clara said, "that I told my group the night of the fire that going south was wrong. Before we started, I said it then." "I heard that," Eliza said. "I heard you corrected Clyde's account." Clara met her eyes. Something uncomfortable shifted in them. "I've been—" She stopped. "I said things about you when Rhett chose you, said them to more than one person. I told people he'd made a mistake that he'd recognize eventually." She held herself very straight. "I want to tell you that I was wrong about that. And I want to tell you directly rather than through what the settlement is saying, which is already extensive." Eliza looked at her. "Why?" she said. Not harshly. Just the honest question. Clara looked slightly thrown by it. "Because it's the right thing to do." "The right thing to do would have been not to say those things in the first place," Eliza said. "I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because you're framing this as a larger moral gesture than it actually is." She kept her voice even. "You're apologizing because things changed publicly, and it costs you something now to hold your old position. That's honest, and I respect it more than I'd respect a speech about principle. But let's be clear about what it is." Clara stared at her. "You didn't do anything to me that hadn't been done before." Eliza said. You're not the first person to decide I wasn't worth taking seriously. I survived it from you the same way I survived it from everyone else, by doing what was in front of me and keeping my own counsel. She paused. If you want to have a different relationship going forward, I'm willing to try that. But I'm not going to tell you the old one didn't happen. The silence lasted for a moment. Then Clara said, with a different quality in her voice, something stripped down. You're not at all what I expected when I walked in here. What did you expect? I don't know, gratitude or anger. She looked at her hands, something I knew how to respond to. I have both of those things, Eliza said. I just don't spend them on conversations they won't improve. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, My mother was plain. People treated her the way they treated you. I watched it my whole childhood. I told myself it wasn't fair, and then I grew up and I did the same thing to someone else. She said it like a woman pulling a splinter, quickly, because the slow version was worse. I don't know what to do with that. Eliza was quiet for a moment. I don't know either, she said finally. I don't have a solution to that particular problem, but I think the starting point is probably what you just did. Clara nodded. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. She had the careful control of someone who had learned young that emotion was a vulnerability. But something in her eyes was doing the work of it without the tears. Eliza put the kettle on the stove. Sit down, she said. I'll make coffee. Rhett came home that evening to find 2 coffee cups on the table and Eliza at the kitchen window, looking at the hill. He looked at the cups, then at her. Clara Whitmore was here, she said. He sat down at the table. How was it? Hard, she said honestly. And then better. She turned from the window. It won't be simple. She has a lot of old habits. So do I, he said. Itat. She almost smiled. You do. She sat down across from him. The settlement is going to change. After the fire, with the land situation shifting, it's going to be different here. The balance of things. You think Hargrove's finished? I think he's set back considerably, she said. Not finished. Men like that don't finish easily. But the 3 families on the vulnerable list are better protected now. People know their situations. People are watching. The records are solid. That matters. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table and then he looked at her, and there was something in his face that he had been working toward for months, she thought. Something that had been assembling itself piece by piece through every practical conversation and every shared silence, and every moment he'd found a barrel moved to the right position and she'd found a hook installed on a wall. When I married you, he said, I told you I'd give you time. She met his eyes. You did, huh? I've been thinking about whether the time is still what I want between us, he said. He was not a man who dressed things up. She had always known that and always valued it, even when it made the edges of things harder. I'm not interested in the arrangement anymore. I'm interested in you. Actually, in you, not the practical version of you I described in the yard. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I'm just not willing to pretend I don't feel it. She looked at him across the table. This difficult, careful, honest man who had walked across a crowded yard toward her when nobody in the world would have expected it, and had meant every word of it, and had shown her every day since then in the small language of moved barrels and pine salve and 30-second conversations that had grown into something else. I've been feeling it for a while, she said. I was waiting to see if you'd figure it out. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Rhett Calloway was not a man who smiled easily or often, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that meant the same thing on him. I figured it out. You did, she said. Eventually. I'm a slow reader, he said, but I'm thorough. She laughed. It came out surprised and real, and she let it, because there was no one here to perform anything for, just the kitchen and the evening light, and this man who had, through some combination of stubbornness and clarity she still couldn't entirely account for, decided she was worth the reading. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, the hill that Eliza had climbed every day for 8 months sat in the late August light, dry still, but not hopeless. The kitchen garden holding on, the fence line maintained, the outbuildings in better order than they'd been in years. Below in the valley, the settlement was doing what settlements do after catastrophe, arguing and mourning and rebuilding and gradually, unevenly, beginning to understand what it now knew that it hadn't known before. In the weeks that followed, people would come to the hill in ones and twos, asking about the water storage problem, asking about the legal records, asking about the canyon route, and what else Eliza knew about the terrain they'd all lived beside for years without fully learning. Lena Marsh came back, as promised. Walt Ferris brought his son. Agnes Purdy sat at the kitchen table one afternoon for 2 hours working through a land document that she'd been too isolated to get a second opinion on before, and when she left with something cleaner than she'd arrived with. Rhett watched it happen. He watched the house his homestead had been becoming, which was something different from what he had described in the yard on the spring morning when he'd asked her to come. Something larger, less tidy, more alive. He was not a man who would have described himself as surprised. He had known she was worth choosing. He had not known exactly what choosing her would make possible. He was learning. The first real rain came in September, not the false start of July, not a single hard night that ran off the cracked earth and left nothing behind, but 3 days of slow, steady, soaking rain that came in from the northwest and stayed, filling the creek back to its proper level, darkening the soil from pale gray to brown, bringing out a smell from the ground that people in the valley hadn't realized they'd been missing until it was back. Children stood in it. Farmers walked their properties in it, looking at the earth the way you look at something you were afraid you'd lost. Eliza stood on the porch and watched it fall, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since May. The kitchen garden had made it through the drought thinner than she'd hoped, but alive. The water capture system had held, the early morning rationing had held, and what came up in September was not abundant, but it was real, and it was hers. She harvested what was ready and put up what could be put up, and the work of it was satisfying in the particular way of things that were earned rather than given. Rhett found her in the garden on the second day of rain, both of them wet through in the way that stops mattering after a while. He helped her bring in the last of the squash without being asked, and they worked side by side in the gray light. And she thought about the distance between this and the morning she'd stood at the fence post with her sewing basket watching a crowd she hadn't intended to be part of. And the distance was large enough that she couldn't see across it clearly. She had become someone she didn't entirely recognize from that earlier vantage point. She wasn't sure if that was frightening or simply true. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. You're thinking louder than usual." She straightened up with a squash under each arm. "I was thinking about the day you chose me, what I looked like standing there, what I was thinking." He waited. "I was thinking I needed to get past the crowd to Mabel Hutchins' house," she said. "I was not thinking about you at all." Something moved in his face. "And now?" "Now I think you may have seen something I hadn't decided yet about myself," she said. "That bothers me a little. I like to think I know my own mind." "You know your own mind better than anyone I've met," he said. "That's different from knowing what you're capable of. Those are separate things." She considered that. The rain came down steadily around them. "You knew what I was capable of?" "I knew what I saw," he said. "The fence post. The way you handled problems. I didn't know what you'd do with a year and a reason. I hoped." He met her eyes. "I was right to." She looked at him in the rain and thought, "This is not the life I planned." She had planned. If planning was even the word for the quiet, private survival strategies she'd been running since her early 20s, for a life that was smaller than this. A room, steady work, the satisfaction of a seam that held. She had not planned for a man who read her carefully and told her the truth and moved barrels to the right position without making speeches about it. She had not planned for Lena Marsh calling her by her first name, or Agnes Purdy sitting at her kitchen table, or 34 people coming out the far side of a canyon in the dark. Nobody plans for the things that turn out to matter most. That was the thing she had learned this year, that she would carry forward into every year after it. You work with what's in front of you, you do it well, and if you're lucky and stubborn enough, something accumulates that you couldn't have built if you'd tried to build it directly. She went back to the squash. "Come on," she said. "We're losing the light." October arrived, and with it the community work of recovery in earnest. The 3 properties lost in the fire were being rebuilt. Not quickly, not without difficulty, but with the particular collective effort of a settlement that had been reminded of what individual isolation cost. The Parton brothers, who had spent most of their time in Blackstone Ridge operating at the margins of community life by preference and circumstance, found themselves receiving help they hadn't asked for and accepted it with a gruffness that was its own form of gratitude. The Marsh property's south pasture wall was reinforced in a single Saturday, 8 people working, Eliza and Rhett among them, Lena Marsh moving between everyone with coffee and the specific energy of a woman who had decided she was going to participate in her own rescue rather than receive it. Hargrove was present in this period the way a weather system is present after it passes, in the evidence it leaves, not in its direct force. His East Pasture operation remained ash. The pending filings had been returned for revision and had not been resubmitted. He appeared in town occasionally, conducted his business, spoke to people in the careful tone of a man navigating changed terrain. The consolidation push, the whole organized pressure that Agnes had come to Blackstone Ridge to document and resist, had not ended, but it had stopped moving, which was different from ending and mattered differently. Agnes explained it to Eliza one afternoon in October, sitting on the hill while Rhett was in the lower pasture. Operations like his need momentum, Agnes said. They need the sense that acquisition is inevitable, that the people being pushed out don't have anywhere to turn. When that sense breaks, when people see someone push back and the pushing back works, the operation loses its primary tool, which isn't money or legal filings. It's the belief that resistance is pointless. She looked out at the valley below. You broke that belief. We broke it, Eliza said, with less conviction about the correction than she'd once had. She was getting better at receiving the truth when the truth was inconvenient to her modesty. You can keep saying that, Agnes said. It doesn't change what I watched happen. Eliza looked at her. Why did you stay? After the fire, with the filings withdrawn, you'd done what you came to do. Agnes was quiet for a moment. She had a quality of stillness about her that Eliza had come to recognize as thought rather than reserve. I came here to stop something from happening, she said. That's finished, or mostly finished, but I've been building something here at the same time without really intending to, and it turns out I'm more interested in building than I expected. She paused. There's a difference between a place you came to defend and a place you belong to. I think I'm finding out which one this is. Dimbambat Bolti. Is there a verdict? Not yet, Agnes said, but I'm not leaving. The town hall meeting was Walt Ferris's idea. He brought it to Eliza first, which she noticed, and which she suspected Walt also noticed but chose not to comment on. The idea was practical, a formal gathering for the settlement, not a crisis meeting but a planning one, to discuss the water management infrastructure that needed rebuilding after the drought, the land documentation protocols that Agnes had been quietly spreading through the valley, and the question of whether Blackstone Ridge had the organizational capacity to handle the next Hargrove. Because there would be a next one, Walt said. There was always a next one, and the question was whether they were going to be surprised by it again. You should run it, he told Eliza. She looked at him. You've been in this settlement for 20 years, and you have 3 times my credibility with the long-term families. I have credibility with the long-term families, he agreed. You have credibility with everyone, including some of the long-term families now. He said this without apparent personal irritation, just the practical statement of a man who understood where things stood. The meeting will go better with you in front of it. Rhett, she said. I'll stand beside you, Rhett said from the doorway, where he had apparently been listening for some time. But Walt's right. You should run it. She looked at both of them. They looked back at her with the expressions of men who had arrived at a conclusion and were not planning to argue about it. Fine, she said. The meeting was held in Harlan Voss's warehouse, which was the largest interior space in Blackstone Ridge and smelled permanently of grain and old wood, and the particular dust of a building that had housed decades of community business. People filed in on a Thursday evening in late October, more than Eliza had expected, actually, which said something about how the calculus of engagement had shifted since spring. Families who would not have come to a community meeting 6 months ago, who had not seen the point of participating in a structure that felt controlled by other interests, came and found seats and settled in with the watchful expectancy of people who were not yet certain they belonged but were willing to find out. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. There were 70, maybe 75 people. She knew most of their faces now. She knew, behind most of the faces, something specific. A water storage problem, a documentation gap, a child's name, a particular stubbornness that was an asset in one direction and a liability in another. 8 months of moving through this settlement in the particular near-invisible way she moved had given her a map of it that nobody else had exactly, because nobody else had been watching from exactly her vantage point. She did not make a speech. She had thought about this carefully beforehand. The temptation to mark the occasion with language that matched its scale, to say something that sounded like a conclusion. She resisted it. What these people needed was not a conclusion. What they needed was a next step, and a next step after that, and the accumulation of those steps into something that held. She started with the water system. Specific, technical, the actual problem, and the actual response to it. Who had done what? What had worked? What needed doing next? Agnes handled the land documentation section, which she did with a precision that made Eliza quietly proud. Watching her stand in front of a room that 6 months ago had not known she existed and lay out a complex legal landscape in language that every person in that room could follow. The room was quiet and engaged in the way that rooms are when people feel that the information being presented concerns them directly. She watched faces. The Parton brothers with their arms crossed, not in resistance, but in the particular posture of men absorbing information through a defensive frame, which was their way. Lena Marsh leaning slightly forward, Cora Ferris, now 60, sitting beside her father and watching everything with those sharp young eyes that Eliza suspected would go somewhere beyond Blackstone Ridge eventually. And in the back of the room, seated together with an uprightness that was its own kind of statement, Hargrove and Stanek. They had come, which she had not expected. They listened, which she had expected less. Near the end of the meeting, Walt Ferris stood and said, "I want to say something that isn't on the agenda." He looked around the room. Some of you have been in this valley long enough to remember when Rhett Calloway showed up and built that property on the hill. He was already known as a man you didn't cross unnecessarily. That reputation didn't change. But something else happened this year that I don't think most of us have said plainly yet. He paused. Eliza Calloway saved a number of lives in that canyon. Before that, she spent months quietly making sure that when trouble came, people had something to stand on instead of standing in open air. She did it without making noise about it and without asking for anything in return. He looked at Eliza. I want to say that plainly, in front of everyone, because it deserves to be said plainly. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a sound came from it that was not applause exactly. It was more complex than applause, something that had agreement and acknowledgement and the particular discomfort of a community recognizing something it had gotten wrong, all mixed together. The Parton brothers uncrossed their arms. Lena Marsh was doing the careful, controlled thing with her eyes that meant she was not going to cry in public. Agnes was looking at the wall with a small expression that might have been satisfaction. Eliza stood at the front of the room and felt the sound move over her and had a complicated, human, imperfect response to it that involved gratitude and old hurt, and a tiredness that was not the bad kind and something else underneath all of it that she didn't have a word for. The feeling of being seen, finally, without performance, without the armor of invisibility, without the long practice of making yourself small enough not to be a target. Just seen, as the actual person she was. She looked at Rhett. He was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms folded and his hat pushed back and his gray-green eyes on her. And on his face was the expression she'd been learning to read for 8 months. The one that wasn't quite a smile but held everything a smile held. The one that said, I knew. I knew from the beginning. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the room. Thank you, she said. Now let's talk about the East Water Channel because it's going to be an issue before spring and nobody's going to want to deal with it in mud. The room came back to business. The moment settled into the evening. Life, which is not a story with a clean arc and a final note, continued its irregular and imperfect course. In the months that followed, things changed in Blackstone Ridge the way things actually change. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and complications, nobody behaving perfectly, progress neither smooth nor guaranteed. Hargrove made one more attempt in November, a quiet approach through a different legal channel that Agnes caught within 2 weeks and documented thoroughly. When Rhett presented Webb's office with the documentation and the context of the previous withdrawn filings, the new attempt was effectively neutralized before it gained traction. Hargrove did not try a third time, at least not that year. He pulled back to his remaining properties and kept his own counsel. And whether that represented a genuine change of approach or simply a longer pause was a question Eliza held without resolution, because some questions don't resolve cleanly and require ongoing attention instead. Stanek, interestingly, separated himself from Hargrove's operations by December. He came to Rhett's property one morning unannounced, which took a particular kind of nerve, and sat at the kitchen table and said that he had been complicit in things he was no longer willing to be complicit in, and that he would like to discuss whether his east boundary water access could be arranged properly through the new community documentation system rather than through informal channels. It was not a redemption, it was a transaction, an exit from a situation that had stopped being profitable. Eliza was in the room for it, and she let it be what it was without requiring it to be more, because some changes are principled and some are practical, and both of them move things in the same direction. Dorothea Crane was harder and more interesting. She never made a formal gesture like Clara's kitchen visit. What she did instead was gradually, over the course of the winter, stop making comments. She stopped being the voice that put a fine point on Eliza's plainness or her lack of social credential. She began, cautiously, to stop and talk when she and Eliza passed on the road, about practical things, the price of cloth at the trading post, the state of the winter road, the Ferris family's situation. It was not friendship. It might become something adjacent to it, eventually. Eliza was not in a hurry. She had learned that the useful transformations in human beings take longer than anyone wants them to, and that impatience with the pace of other people's change is a way of prioritizing your own comfort over their actual progress. She had a version of this conversation with Clara Whitmore one afternoon in November, and Clara listened to it with the expression of a woman who recognized herself in what was being described. "You're more patient than I'd be," Clara said. "I don't think I am, particularly," Eliza said. "I think I've just had more practice at waiting for people to see what's actually there." "Does it get easier, the waiting?" Eliza thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "But you get better at knowing what to do with the time while you're waiting." Clara looked at her hands. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." "All right. Did you ever think about leaving after everything, the comments, the exclusions, everything people did? Did you ever think it wasn't worth staying?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. She gave the question the honest consideration it deserved. "I thought about it once," she said. "Around the time of the canning session, I thought about what it would mean to simply go somewhere that didn't have the history of how people here already saw me. Start over plain, without all the weight." She looked out the window at the hill. At the line of the property, she'd spent 8 months building into something. "But I'd have been taking myself with me. And I'd already decided the problem wasn't me." Clara looked at her for a long time. "I'm sorry I was part of making you think about leaving." "I know you are," Eliza said. "I believe that." The dedication of the new community water building happened in early December, when the first light snow had dusted the ridge and the valley sat in the particular clean stillness of winter's beginning. It was not an elaborate event, a gathering, some words from Walt Ferris about what the building represented, a practical explanation from Agnes about how the documentation system it housed would work. People came in their coats and their breath showed in the cold air, and they stood together with the comfortable closeness of people who had been through a hard year and were standing on the other side of it. Harlan Voss made a small speech about the settlement's resilience and the bravery of those who had led the fire evacuation, and he looked at Rhett when he said it, because Rhett was the figure people had the category for. The strong man, the protector, the story that fit the frame. Rhett listened to his name with the patience of a man waiting for something to finish. When Voss was done, he stood and said, "I want to correct something." The gathering quieted. "What happened in August," he said. "The canyon, the families who made it through, that happened because of preparation. That started in April and continued through the summer, preparation that most of you didn't see because it wasn't performed for an audience." He looked out at the gathered faces, the Parton brothers, the Marsh family, Agnes, the Ferris family, Lena's son who was standing slightly taller than he had in the summer, Walt Ferris with his carpenter's hands folded in front of him. I can carry things through narrow passages in the dark. That's not nothing. But I was following a route that someone else had found and understood and judged to be sound. I want that said plainly here, so it doesn't get lost in the retelling. He looked at Eliza. She was standing at the edge of the gathering in her coat with her hands in her pockets, and she was looking back at him, and people were turning toward her with the particular quality of attention that arrives when a story reconfigures itself in real time. When people realized the shape they'd been holding was the wrong shape, and the right shape was standing right there all along. Her, Rhett said. It was her. The silence lasted a beat. Then Lena Marsh said clearly, yes, it was. And the gathering moved in the way of a thing that has found its right level. A settling rather than an eruption. A recognition rather than a revelation. People who had known and people who were understanding now for the first time stood together in the cold December air, and the woman they were looking at stood among them and did not perform any response to it. She looked at the building. She looked at the documentation system Agnes had built inside it, the water channel records, the family land files, the small organized archive of a community that had decided to know its own terrain. She thought about the fence post at the Henderson place 3 years ago, the silent, quick repair that no one had noticed, the particular invisible competence of a woman who does what needs doing without waiting to be asked. She thought about what Rhett had said in September. I knew what I saw. I didn't know what you'd do with a year and a reason. She thought about what it meant that the frontier's willingness to see her had not preceded her usefulness but followed it, and about whether that was a tragedy or simply the truth about how human beings are. That they mostly see what they're shown after the showing, not before. And that waiting for prior recognition before you act is a way of letting other people's blindness determine your scope. She had never let that happen, not because she was exceptional, but because she had never had the luxury of waiting. And here, now, on the other side of a year that had taken everything she had and returned it to her transformed, she stood in the snow and understood that the not waiting had been the thing. The quiet, consistent work, the patterns noticed and acted on, the help given without announcement, not as performance of worthiness, but as the natural expression of a person who had decided somewhere early and without fanfare that she was going to engage with the world as it was and make of it what she could. That was the lesson, if there was a lesson. Not that the overlooked will be recognized eventually. Sometimes they aren't, and pretending otherwise is a comfortable lie. But that the work done in the absence of recognition is still real work, still holds, still matters. The families in the canyon had been safe not because the settlement had finally decided Eliza Calloway deserved credit, but because she had spent months preparing a route regardless of whether anyone was watching. The credit had come later. The preparation had come when it mattered. Rhett came to stand beside her. He didn't take her hand in public. He was not a man for public gestures. But he stood close enough that their arms touched through their coats, and that was its own language, one they had both become fluent in over the course of a year. How are you doing? He said, low. I'm all right, she said, and meant it. I'm genuinely all right. Around them, people began to move toward the warmth that Harlan Voss had arranged inside. Coffee, and the particular social metabolism of a settlement that was still, against everything, alive and arguing and figuring itself out. Snow was beginning again, light and unhurried, settling on the ridge and the valley and the dry canyon and the rebuilt fence lines and the kitchen garden that was sleeping now and would come back in spring. Eliza stood in it for a moment longer before going in. She let the cold settle on her face and looked at the valley below, at the lights coming on in the early dark, at the place she had not intended to be the center of and had become essential to anyway, and she thought about all the things she had not planned for and how they had turned out to be the things worth having. Then she went inside, out of the cold, to where the people were.